Alright, back again. For those of you who were around back around 2007, 2008, and 2009, maybe a little bit into 2010, you probably remember these really small computers that were around that had very low power processors and were designed basically for web, email, and a little word processing here and there. And eventually they earned the name the Netbook, or netbooks. Now, there was a huge craze for netbooks back in the late 2000s, around 2008 through 2010 or 2011. But after the iPad was introduced in 2010, netbooks started to fall into a category where nobody really wanted them. And if you don't believe me, well, just watch the iPad introduction video. There's a channel called Every Apple Video, or Every Apple Keynote, or Every Steve Jobs Video. That's the one. And just look up iPad introduction in the search box, and at some point in the video, you will hear Steve Jobs criticizing netbooks for being slow, crappy, unreliable machines, essentially. However, they really weren't slow and unreliable, as when they first came out, they were actually pretty small. They were a lot smaller than this. This is an 8.9-inch netbook, which was typical for most netbooks. But when they first came out, they had 7-inch screens, and it was pretty hard to see anything on the screen. So that's why they started to make the netbooks just a tad bigger and bumped up the resolution a little bit. So here we have a pretty familiar sight. Some of you might remember this from back in the day. This is the Dell Inspiron Mini 10V, which is a variant of the Inspiron Mini line. They had the Inspiron Mini 9, they had the Inspiron Mini 10, 10V, 1012, and 1018. And I think they also had a 12-inch netbook, the Mini 12, but that was a failure from what I remember. This is just one I was able to get on eBay for $50 using some of the PayPal money I made selling some of my old laptops. So I thought I'd make a video about this and reminisce about the days of old with netbooks. Actually, I really wanted one of these Dell Minis when they were new. I was in 5th grade at the time, and and my parents and I made a deal that I would get the Dell Mini 9 if I got really good grades. Did I ever get it? No, I ended up getting a Toshiba Satellite A305 S6905 because the Mini 9, they only allowed up to a 16 gigabyte hard drive for the Windows version, whereas if you got it with Ubuntu, you could go up to a 64 gigabyte drive from the factory. Now, of course, you could upgrade that, but yeah, I don't know. I guess I just wasn't thinking clearly back then. But now I actually have an Inspiron Mini to play with, so we'll go ahead and take a little tour of it. We'll start with the ports. On this side you have your SD card slot here, which I believe supports SDHC. You have two USB 2.0 ports, your power, Kensington lock. On the other side you have your Ethernet, VGA out, USB 2, microphone, and headphone jacks, and that about concludes it for the ports. One thing I really don't like about this netbook is that it doesn't have an easy access door to upgrade the RAM. This actually goes to the wireless card, and then this is the battery right here. But it doesn't have any door to upgrade the RAM. You have to take the whole thing apart to upgrade the RAM on this thing. So it's really a pain in the ass to upgrade. I don't know why, because on the Mini 9, Dell had an access door right about here where you could upgrade the RAM, SSD, and add a mobile broadband card if you wanted to. By the way, if you want that Windows XP Home Edition key, go ahead and pause the video. Since Windows XP is basically not necessarily an abandoned operating system, but unsupported, I can give you that key. So I know people sometimes like to get Windows keys, so just pause the video if you want that key. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this thing, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the history of netbooks. This model has a I think it's 1.66 gigahertz, but let me check that again. That's why we have the system properties. It has, but it's an Atom, which is what most netbooks used. It's an Atom N270, which is what most netbooks use. Yeah, 1.6 gigahertz and 1 gigabyte of RAM. It also has a 120 gigabyte hard drive, and you're looking at my work email. God, I hate this touchpad. But I'll explain that a little later. It has a webcam up there, which is pretty terrible quality, if you ask me. But you really shouldn't expect much from a netbook, because I remember trying these things in the Best Buy back in 2009, and they had the webcams were. The one on the Mini 9 was absolutely horrendous. I think it was only 0.3 megapixels. This one I think is 1.3 megapixels. But I don't really do too much video chatting, so I don't really care about that. One thing I do like about the Mini 10 is it has a nice large keyboard to type on. Most netbooks had small crammed keyboards that had really squished down keys, especially the earlier ones like the Asus EPC. They had really squished down keys. Even the Mini 9 had the function keys on the home row here, and some of the keys like the control key and the tab key were really small. On the Mini 10 they made the keyboard a lot larger. I know Toshiba made a netbook that had a chiclet keyboard, but I actually prefer this kind of a keyboard. Even though some people say, oh, it's all mashed together, well, this keyboard is actually satisfactory for me. I can actually type on this, unlike the Fujitsu Lifebook P1610, which has such a minuscule keyboard. My fingers are, even someone with small fingers like me, can't even type on it. As for the touchpad, I am not a fan of this touchpad at all, because on the Mini 9, it had a pretty regular touchpad with the buttons down here, but the buttons were separate. They weren't built into the touchpad like they are in the Mini 10. On the Mini 10, the buttons are built into the touchpad, which makes it really easy to click on something you don't want. This is your left click, this is your right click. The problem is there's a little bit of dead space around these buttons, and the problem is it's also very sensitive with the tapping, the tap to click. Now, of course, you can turn that off, which I did, but you always end up tapping or clicking the buttons when you don't want to. So that's one thing I really don't like about this, is the touchpad. As for graphics, it has a typical Intel GMA 945, which was pretty typical for netbooks, nothing special. You could run some old MS-DOS games on here, or maybe some N64 games, probably SNES if you wanted to do emulation. But for what I use this computer for, I just have Firefox installed and a lightweight install of XP Professional Service Pack 3, even though these were licensed with Home Edition. Another fun fact about these netbooks was these were in fact the last machines that you could buy that ran Windows XP, because when netbooks first came out, Windows Vista was kind of a new thing. But as many may remember, Windows Vista was a very hardware-demanding operating system. As you saw in my previous video, the Home Basic Edition didn't even run well on the Fujitsu Lifebook P1610, and that's a Core Solo with 1 gigabyte of RAM, and that's a lot more powerful than an Intel Atom. But even the Home Basic Edition wouldn't run on it. And so I think HP and Acer were the only two companies that made a netbook running Vista. HP made the Mini Note. I can't remember the model number, but it was called the Mini Note, and it used a VIA C7 CPU, which was extremely underpowered to run Vista. It was not fit for Vista at all. And Acer made one with I think it was either a Core Solo or Core 2 Solo that ran Windows Vista Home Basic, which was better, but it wasn't exactly Vista material, if you will. And then when Windows XP was retired from the sales floor, they started shipping them with Windows 7 Starter Edition, which ran pretty well, but they still ran a lot better with XP, and it was usually XP Home Edition. But now that I think back, I'm kind of glad I didn't buy one of these netbooks, because I probably wouldn't have had a real big use for them, because I do a little bit more. I do video editing and stuff like that. So down the road, when as my channel grows, I would have needed something like my MacBook Pro over there to do my video editing, because something like this mini netbook doesn't even have near the processing power for something like Final Cut or Sony Vegas or something like that. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I've taken this places with me. I've taken it to work a couple times, and it's a nice little travel mate laptop. But yeah, I just thought I'd do a quick video on this netbook and talk about some of the history of netbooks a little bit. And yeah, Dell does have drivers for Windows 7 for this model, so in the future I might make a video about me upgrading this to Windows 7, although it would probably be the starter edition, because I really don't know if I want to go through the trouble of upgrading the RAM. I know this can take up to a max of 2 gigabytes of RAM, and and you couldn't buy Windows 7 Starter Edition in the US when Windows 7 was first released, so I'll probably have to check eBay and see if I can find a copy that's not one of those counterfeit discs or stolen MSDN keys. Well, I've actually been doing a little research, and I actually found this on eBay. It is a actual copy of Windows 7 Starter Edition, and I had seen an Indonesian copy back in 2011, but I had haven't seen one since, and this is a 5-pack of Windows 7 Starter, although it claims, I don't know if you guys can see that, but it claims that it can only be activated in Latin America and the Caribbean. But yeah, I'm sure there's a registry hack where you can get it to activate here. And I know Microsoft isn't as strict with activation as they used to be, so I bet if I ordered this, it's only $30. I bet if I ordered this, I could probably get it to activate.